My name is Dren Vallows. I was, at the time, a junior sensor analyst stationed aboard the Pelorian Council's observation post Kiva Station, a mid-sized installation anchored at the edge of what we called the Outer Veil Corridor, which is a long, drift-heavy stretch of space connecting the inner cluster systems to the deeper unmapped territories beyond Sector 7. My job, if I am being precise about it, was to watch for debris, to flag mining ships that wandered off their registered lanes, and to occasionally file reports that nobody at the council level ever actually read. It was not a glamorous posting. Most weeks, the most exciting thing that happened was a calibration error on the long-range array that made an ordinary asteroid red like a comet. So when I saw that alert, my first instinct was calibration error. My second instinct, when the secondary sensors confirmed it, was equipment failure. My third instinct, when the tertiary sensors and the backup array all said the same thing, was that I needed to get my senior officer out of bed immediately. I calmed Commander Celebreth at 6:14 station time. She answered on the fourth ping, which told me she had been asleep. She had a habit of answering on the first ping whenever she was already awake and pretending she hadn't been worrying about something. 4 pings meant I had genuinely interrupted her rest. "Dren Vallows," she said, and her voice was the careful flat tone she used when she was deciding whether to be annoyed. "This better not be the array again." "It is not the array," I said. "All 3 systems are reading the same thing, and Commander, the mass reading on this contact. I need you to look at it." There was a pause, a real pause, the kind that means someone is already pulling up their own display. Then she said, "That number cannot be right." "I thought so too," I told her. "I ran verification twice." Another pause, then, "How far out?" "Outer veil margin, approximately 9 light minutes from our position at current bearing." "Have we raised it?" "No response to standard hail on 6 frequencies. It is not broadcasting any identification. No beacon, no registry, no flight plan filed with any of the 3 corridor control stations." I heard her moving. Getting dressed, I assumed, or pulling her uniform on while she walked. "Is it moving?" "That is the other thing I wanted to show you," I said. "Commander, it is moving very slowly, almost like it is drifting or waiting." She came to the operations floor 4 minutes later. I know it was 4 minutes because I was watching the clock on the display wall while I waited, one of those small involuntary things a person does when they are frightened and trying not to look frightened. She came in, looked at the main sensor board, and then she stood there for what felt like a long time without saying anything. Senior Commander Celebreth was not a person who stood quietly very often. She was compact and decisive, with the dark blue secondary eyelids of a full-blooded Pelorian that clicked shut when she was processing something difficult, and right now both of those eyelids were doing exactly that. Click, click, click. The involuntary blink of a species trying to recalibrate. "Get me the Council liaison on the secure channel," she said, finally. "And get me the Merchant Guild traffic logs for this corridor going back 30 cycles. I want to know if anything passed through here recently that might have been carrying something it shouldn't." "Yes, Commander, and the object itself." She looked at the mass reading again. The number was still the same. The number was, as she had said, one that did not seem like it should be right. "Keep hailing it," she said quietly. "Standard greeting protocols on all frequencies, and add the emergency open channel frequency as well." She hesitated. "All species libraries." I turned back to my board. All species libraries was something we almost never said. Our station was equipped with greeting protocols for 47 recognized species, everything from the layered harmonic calls of the Kethavari to the complex color pulse sequences of the Murren Deep. Using all of them together was the interstellar equivalent of throwing every key you owned at a lock and hoping one of them fit. We only did it when we genuinely did not know what we were talking to. I began running the sequence. Kethavari harmonics first, then Murrin pulses, then the flat-frequency Grull signal, then the chirped Senari beacon pattern. Standard Galactic Council Common followed, the 9-tone recognition sequence that served as a lingua franca for most of the inner cluster. Then, the 17 other formats in descending order of regional frequency. Nothing answered. The object sat at the edge of the outer veil and did not move and did not speak, and the mass reading on my board did not change, and the number was still wrong, still too large, still something that my instruments had no category for. I sent a verification ping to the corridor control relay at Veth Station, 40 light minutes distant, requesting they confirm our readings with their own independent sensors. The light speed delay meant we would not hear back for over an hour. I ate the rest of my cold, pressed grain at my station and watched the board and tried not to think about the number. The reply from Veth Station came back in 53 minutes, which meant they had answered almost immediately, which meant their operators had seen the same thing on their own boards and had been watching it too, waiting for someone else to say something first. Their message was short. Official format, corridor control header, the usual authentication codes, but the text itself was only 2 sentences. We confirm your sensor readings. We have no classification for this contact type. That was when Commander Celebreth requested an emergency priority connection to the Pelorian Council Security Division on the intercluster relay. That connection took 11 minutes to establish, which was actually fast for a priority request, faster than it should have been, which suggested the Council's own long-range arrays had already picked up the anomaly, and someone there was sitting very upright in their chair as well. What we did not know yet, what nobody on Kiva Station knew for several more hours, was that the contact had already been detected by at least 7 other monitoring stations along the outer veil margin. We found this out later, when the incident logs were compiled and cross-referenced. 7 stations. 7 sets of operators who had looked at their boards, seen a number that didn't belong, and started making calls with careful flat voices to people they needed to get out of bed. And the object still had not moved, and it still had not answered. Part 2, what the records say and what they don't. I am going to tell you something that the official council summary of this event does not include. The Interstellar Council, in its formal documentation of the Outer Veil incident, which is what they called it in the early records before they knew what to call it, describes the initial detection as a routine anomaly flagged by peripheral monitoring infrastructure. This is technically accurate. A sensor alert is a sensor alert. The word routine is doing a lot of quiet work in that sentence, though, because what the official summary does not describe is the way the operations floor on Kiva Station felt for those first 3 hours. I have been in alert situations before. I have been on shift during debris field warnings, during the tail end of a Grull territorial expansion push that came uncomfortably close to our corridor, during a medical quarantine lock that had us sealed in quarters for 4 days, while the medical division figured out what one of the cargo handlers had picked up on a stopover layover. Alert situations have a texture to them, a kind of tight, purposeful anxiety. People move faster, speak in shorter sentences, stop being polite about interrupting each other. This was not like that. This was quieter than a normal alert. That is the word I keep coming back to. The operations floor was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate, like the whole room was holding itself still. People spoke when they needed to and then stopped. Nobody speculated out loud. Nobody made the jokes that people usually make during extended alert watches, the dry, slightly desperate humor that is how most spacefaring species cope with stress. None of that. Just the hum of the systems and the soft cycling of sensor pings and people sitting in their chairs and watching numbers that shouldn't be. I think it was the mass reading that did it. That was the thing that made the room quiet, because mass readings don't lie the way visual contacts can lie. Visuals can be reflections, can be sensor ghosts, can be debris clouds with unusual geometric clustering. Mass readings are mass. What you are sensing is the actual gravitational presence of a physical object. And the gravitational presence of this object was telling us something that should not have been possible. The object was larger than anything we had a category for. I will be specific, because the specifics matter for understanding what comes after. The largest warship class in active deployment at the time of this incident was the Pelorian Council's Sovereign-class strategic vessel, a design that represented 300 years of accumulated military engineering and represented the absolute upper boundary of what was considered achievable in terms of single-hull construction. Sovereign-class ships were enormous. They were so enormous that docking them required purpose-built facilities, and their approach into any inhabited system required a full 48-hour advance notification period, because their gravitational profile was measurable by civilian instruments at significant range. The object in the outer veil corridor had a mass reading that was approximately 6 times that of a Sovereign-class vessel. 6 times, on a single hull, which was what the sensor readings indicated, not a fleet formation, not a cluster of vessels traveling in close proximity, but a single continuous object. That number was not possible. We knew it was not possible because the engineering mathematics of it were not compatible with anything in our understanding of hull construction, propulsion physics, or structural material science. You cannot build a single ship that large. The structural loads alone would tear it apart before you could ever try to accelerate it. We knew this. Every species with spacefaring capability knew this. It was not a debate or a theory. It was settled physics. And yet the number was the number, and it did not change no matter how many times we checked it. Commander Celebreth, in her private log for that watch period, which I have read, because she shared it with me years later, after everything had settled and we were allowed to talk about it, wrote the following. My analyst keeps running verification checks. I keep watching him do it. We both know verification checks will not change what the sensors are saying. We are doing them anyway because it is the only productive feeling action available to us, and the alternative is sitting with the reality of the number, and neither of us is quite ready to do that yet. That is an honest record. That is what those 3 hours actually felt like. The council liaison, when we finally got the secure channel established, was a senior attaché named Vesolin. I had interacted with him twice before on routine matters, and found him to be a precise, somewhat impatient person who communicated in the clipped, efficient phrasing of someone who considered information transmission a transaction best completed quickly. He did not use that phrasing with us on this call. He listened while Commander Celebreth summarized the sensor data. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both about verification methodology. Then he was quiet for longer than his usual pace, and when he spoke again he said, I need you to hold your current position and maintain continuous monitoring. Do not approach the contact. Do not alter your hailing protocol. Do not send any vessel toward it. Understood, Commander Celebreth said. What are you seeing on your end? A pause. We are seeing the same thing you are seeing. And classification. We do not have one. Another pause. This one lasted long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. Then, Commander Celebreth, the contact has been detected on 11 stations now. The Council is convening a special session within the hour. Whatever this is, we are treating it as a Tier 1 sovereign event. I had never heard those words spoken aloud in a real operational context. Tier 1 sovereign event was a classification that existed in emergency protocol documentation, but had never been formally declared in my lifetime, or in Commander Celebreth's lifetime, or in the lifetimes of most people currently serving in any capacity across the Interstellar Council's jurisdiction. It was the classification reserved for situations that exceeded all existing frameworks. Existential scale unknowns, events for which standard procedure did not exist because no one had ever needed standard procedure for them. The Outer Veil incident had been an anomaly for 3 hours. It was now a Tier 1 sovereign event. I looked at my sensor board. The object had still not moved. Part 3, the hour everything changed. I need to talk about what happened at hour 4, because this is the part that most of the official accounts get wrong, not in their facts but in their tone. They describe it as a communication breakthrough or a first successful contact exchange. These descriptions are accurate. They are also completely inadequate. At hour 4 and 17 minutes, station time, the object in the outer veil moved. It did not move far. It did not accelerate toward us. What it did was rotate a slow, deliberate turn, less than 5 degrees of arc shift in its orientation, and then something on its surface activated. We saw this on the visual array. A section of the hull, massive even at this distance, began to emit light. Not drive emissions, not weapon discharge indicators, not anything that matched our threat classification databases. Just light. A steady, brilliant white-gold illumination emanating from a broad panel section of the hull, pulsing slowly in a pattern. The pattern. I recognized what I was seeing before I could name it, the way recognition sometimes arrives before language does. I knew the shape of it, the rhythm, because the pattern was the 9-tone recognition sequence of standard Galactic Council Common, translated visually, rendered in light pulses instead of sound frequencies, each of the 9 tones represented by a distinct flash duration and intensity. Someone on that object had received our hailing signal. Someone had analyzed it, identified the common frequency within it, isolated the 9-tone sequence, translated it from audio to visual, and was now broadcasting it back to us in light. They heard us, I said out loud, which was not a professional thing to say on an operational floor, but I said it anyway because it was the thing that needed to be said. Commander Celebreth was already at the communications console. Acknowledged, she said, meaning she had seen it too. Dren Valo's response, standard council common, audio frequency, established 2-way. My hands were doing things at the board before she finished the sentence. My hands were moving on their own because my higher reasoning was momentarily occupied with the fact that something 6 times the size of the largest warship ever built had heard us talking and had talked back. My hands, for which I am grateful, did not require higher reasoning to operate. The exchange that followed lasted 11 minutes. It is, to my knowledge, the most replayed 11 minutes of archived communications in the history of the Interstellar Council. Every linguistics institution in the inner cluster has analyzed it. There are children on 6 different worlds who learn about it in their primary education modules. I was the analyst who handled the transmission board during those 11 minutes, and I am telling you right now that I cannot remember most of it in real time. I remember fragments. I remember the feeling of my hands at the board and the sound of Commander Celebreth's voice, as she chose words very carefully, and the quality of the silence on the operations floor which had changed from the earlier fearful quiet into something else. A different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when people are witnessing something and know they are witnessing it and do not want to disrupt it. What I remember clearly is the moment the response came back. Not in light pulses this time, in audio. Through our speakers, clear and without distortion, in standard Galactic Council Common, not perfect, not natively spoken, with an accent that was unlike any I had heard before, a quality to the vowel formations that was slightly forward, slightly harder than any Pelorian or Kethavari or Murran speaker, but unmistakably standard common, unmistakably deliberate. Unmistakably someone who had learned our language and was choosing to speak it. The message was 8 words. Kiva Station, this is the ISV Relentless, requesting approach clearance. 8 words, that was all. A ship name, a request, a complete grammatical sentence in a language that was not theirs. 8 words that arrived in the speakers on the operations floor of a mid-sized observation post at the edge of the outer veil corridor. And every person on that floor stopped breathing for what I believe was approximately 3 full seconds. Then Commander Celebreth straightened, put her shoulders back in the unconscious way she did when she was deciding to be the officer she was, and spoke into the comm. ISV Relentless. This is Kiva Station, Commander Celebreth commanding. We receive your message. Please identify species, point of origin, vessel class, and purpose of transit. The response came back faster than the signal delay should have allowed, which told me they had anticipated the question and had their answer prepared. Species human. Point of origin, Sol system, third planet designation Earth. Vessel class, humanity's first sovereign-class warship. Purpose of transit, we are reporting for duty. Part 4, What Nobody Knew. Here is the thing about humanity. The Interstellar Council had records on humanity. This is important context. We were not entirely ignorant. The Pelorian Exploration Division had conducted a survey pass of the Sol system approximately 240 years before the events I am describing, a standard peripheral survey as part of the ongoing cataloging of the Outer Veil territories. The survey ship had done its work at a careful distance, collected atmospheric and biological data from passive sensor sweeps, and filed a report. The report had been assigned a classification number, added to the species registry, and filed in the appropriate archive division. I have read that report now. I have read it many times since. The language it uses is professional and measured, as survey reports are expected to be. But if you read between the formal phrasing, what it says is, we looked at this species, they are small, they are soft, they have no significant spacefaring capability at time of survey, they appear to be in the early stages of developing relevant technology, and they are almost certainly not worth monitoring closely. The report recommended a follow-up survey in approximately 500 years. That recommendation had never been acted on. 500 years had not yet passed. Except that humanity had not waited for the 500 years. Humanity had, in the 240 years since our survey, done something that our survey report had not considered possible. They had built this. The ISV Relentless, full designation Interstellar Sovereign Vessel Relentless, hull number ISV-01, was the first ship of its class, a class that humanity had named without any apparent irony, the Titan class. It had been under construction for 31 years in what we later learned was a purpose-built orbital construction facility in humanity's home system, a project of a scale that had consumed the combined industrial output of their entire species-wide government during that period. 31 years for one ship. When they told us that, in the detailed technical disclosures that came weeks later as part of the formal contact protocols, I remember the reaction from the senior analysts. Most of them found it absurd. Why, they asked, would any rational species spend 31 years building a single vessel? It was inefficient. It was strategically impractical. You could build dozens of mid-class vessels in the same time frame with the same resources and have a far more versatile fleet. The answer, which we understood better with time, was that this was not a practical choice. This was a statement. The Relentless was not built because humanity needed a ship of this specific configuration to accomplish specific military or logistical objectives. It was built because humanity had looked at the galaxy and decided to arrive in it saying something, and this was how they chose to say it. The dimensions, which I will give you now, are not meant to be impressive in the way that a boast impresses. They are just the numbers, and the numbers speak in their own voice. Length 11 kilometers 407 meters. Beam at widest point 2 kilometers 83 meters. Vertical draft 1 kilometer 612 meters. Mass classified in full, but the partial disclosure placed it at approximately 6 times the displacement of a Pelorian sovereign-class vessel, which matched our sensor readings exactly. Hull sections. The ship was divided into 8 primary hull segments, each of which was individually as large as a significant warship in its own right, connected by massive structural transit corridors that were themselves large enough to serve as hangars. Hangar bays, 23 operational. The largest could accommodate 12 Pelorian Sovereign-class ships simultaneously with room for maneuvering. Let me say that again in clearer terms. One of the hangar bays on the Relentless was large enough to hold a full squadron of the biggest ships our civilization had ever built, with space left over. Armament. The full disclosure came in stages and was subject to negotiated transparency agreements, but even the initial partial disclosure was sufficient to produce what I can only describe as a collective pause across every military and strategic planning division in the inner cluster. Not alarm, pause, the kind of stillness that precedes genuine recalibration. Crew complement, 42,611, not a population, a crew. And they had named it Relentless. Of all the names available to them, of all the things they could have chosen to call their first ship of this magnitude, they chose Relentless. Part 5. Approach. Commander Celebreth granted approach clearance. She did not have the authority to do that. Clearance for a contact of this classification required council authorization, and she knew it when she did it. She told me later that she granted it because the alternative was leaving that ship sitting at the edge of the outer veil on an open channel with an unanswered request, and she could not make herself do that. Not to a ship that had asked politely. Not to something that had learned our language and said please, in its own way, by using the right words in the right order. The council, when they found out, did not reprimand her. They were too busy looking at their own censor boards. The Relentless came in slowly. That was the first thing that registered, watching it on the approach display, how slowly it moved. A ship that size, you would expect the approach to feel fast by necessity, the way large objects in proximity feel fast even at low relative velocities because of scale. But the Relentless moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that felt almost careful, considerate, like it was aware of the effect it was having simply by existing in observable range, and was trying not to make things worse. The visual displays updated as it came into closer sensor range. The image that assembled on the main display was. I am going to try to describe it accurately. I have had many years to find the right words, and I am still not entirely sure I have them. The hull was dark. Not black, not the absolute black of space, but a deep gray blue that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that the ship's outline was defined more by what wasn't there than by what was. Structural ridges ran the length of it, massive architectural features that served both engineering and, I think, deliberate visual purposes. The ship was built to be seen, to be recognized as a constructed thing, as something that had been made. Along the spine of the upper hull at intervals were weapons systems not deployed, not active, but visible, because they were designed to be visible even when dormant. They had a quality about them I did not have words for in my own language, but which the human diplomatic materials later described as presence. They were there to be seen. They were there to communicate something about what the ship was capable of even when it was doing nothing. The running lights were gold, not the standard white or blue of most spacecraft navigation lighting. Gold, warm and deliberate, running in lines along the hull sections that gave the ship an outline against space that was almost ceremonial, like a procession, like something that understood it was being watched and had dressed accordingly. And it came in slowly, through the outer veil, past our monitoring stations, into the Sector 7 approach corridor, slowly, carefully. And in the silence of the operations floor, surrounded by people who were trying to remember to breathe, I watched the most significant moment in modern galactic history arrive at about 4% of its maximum rated velocity, which we calculated later, and I thought, they are being gentle. They are trying very hard to be gentle. The formal contact meeting happened 27 hours after the Relentless's first communication, which was how long it took the Council to assemble a diplomatic delegation and transport them to Kiva Station on emergency priority transit. The meeting did not happen on the station itself. The station's conference facilities were not rated for a delegation of the size the Council sent, and there had been significant internal debate about whether to meet aboard the Relentless or to use one of the Council's mobile diplomatic platforms. The Relentless's crew suggested a third option. They would send a shuttle to Kiva Station, a small craft, crew of 12, and the two delegations would meet in whatever space the station could provide. A shuttle, one of the Council attachés said, when this was communicated to us. They sent a shuttle. He said it the way you say something when you are trying to make yourself believe it is real. I did not say the obvious thing, which was that their shuttle, if it was proportionally designed, was probably the size of our entire diplomatic conference wing. It was not quite that large. It was large. It was larger than any shuttle I had seen, and it had the same dark hull treatment as the main vessel, and it descended to Kiva Station's largest docking bay with the same deliberate slowness as the Relentless's approach, and I realized then that this was not accidental. The slowness was not caution about navigation or unfamiliarity with the approach corridor. The slowness was intentional communication. They were moving slowly so that nothing they did would read as sudden, so that everything they did could be seen and processed before the next thing happened. They were managing our reactions, thoughtfully. I was not part of the diplomatic delegation. I was an analyst. I was not in the conference room, but I had duty access to the station's internal systems, which included the visual monitoring logs for the docking bay and the adjoining corridor. And I want to be honest with you about the fact that I watched those logs in real time on my secondary screen while nominally performing other duties. I think most of the operations floor was doing something similar. The shuttle hatch opened. The 12 humans who came out of it, the first humans most of us had ever seen in person, the first humans many of us would ever see in person, did not look like what I had imagined from the survey report. The survey report, 240 years old, had described humans as small bipedal primates, which was technically accurate in the way that technically accurate descriptions are almost always misleading. What the survey report had not conveyed was the way they carried themselves. All 12 of them, even the ones who were clearly crew rather than diplomatic personnel, moved with a quality I did not have a precise word for. Upright. Purposeful. Not aggressive. Nothing in their movement patterns registered as threatening to my observational reading, but solid. Present, like they were entirely comfortable existing in this specific moment in this specific space, and had not considered the possibility that they might not be. The lead delegate was a woman. I learned her name later, Admiral Constance Ewan, Human Species Diplomatic and Military Liaison Command, First Contact Division. She was not tall by human standards, I was told later, roughly average for her species. She was wearing a uniform in deep navy blue and dark gold, the same colors as the Relentless's running lights, and she walked off that shuttle onto Kiva Station as if she had been arriving at places and having them look at her for the entirety of her career, which, I later found out, she essentially had. She stopped at the end of the boarding corridor, looked at the assembled council delegation, and smiled. Not the careful diplomatic smile of someone performing appropriate expression. A real smile, the kind that goes to the eyes, the kind that means something. "Thank you for meeting us here," she said, in standard Galactic Council common. Fluent, unaccented, completely natural, not learned recently, practiced over a long time by someone who had expected to need it. The Council's senior delegate, Envoy Pethseller, who had been doing this work for 60 years and had met representatives of 39 species in formal first contact situations, recovered faster than anyone else in the room and said, "The Council extends formal greetings, Admiral. We were not aware of your approach." "No," Admiral Ewan said pleasantly. We know. We'd like to talk about that actually and a few other things. We have a lot to catch up on, I think. The meeting lasted 9 hours. Part 7. What came out of 9 hours? I cannot reproduce the full content of the formal contact meeting. Much of it remains under restricted classification. Even now, even with the passage of time and the significant changes in the galactic political situation that the contact itself eventually produced. What I can tell you is what was disclosed publicly, and what I personally observed from my position as a peripheral witness, and what I know from Commander Celebreth's account, who was present as the senior station officer. The first hour was structured introduction, species identification, government structure, territorial declarations. Standard contact protocol, which the humans followed precisely, which told us they had the protocol documentation, which was publicly accessible on the Council's general network, so this was not a surprise, but it was still something to note. They had done their research. They had prepared. They had prepared specifically for this moment. The second hour was what the diplomatic record calls capability disclosure. This is the polite term for the part of formal contact protocols where each party describes, in broad strokes, what they can do. Military capacity, technological development level, resource base, population. The Council delegation gave their disclosure in the standard format. The human delegation gave theirs. I want to be careful about how I characterize what happened in the room during that second hour, because I was not there and my information comes second-hand. But Commander Celebreth's account, which she wrote in her private log within hours of the meeting ending, is specific. She writes, "The Council delegates sat with their professional faces on, and their internal states underneath those faces were a different matter entirely. Several of them have secondary color shift responses they cannot fully suppress under genuine stress. It is not embarrassment, it is a physiological indicator. And by the time the human admiral had finished explaining the scope of their manufacturing infrastructure alone, I was counting the indicators around the table and had reached 7. 7 out of 11 delegates. 7 showing involuntary physiological stress responses to information about human industrial output, not to anything aggressive, not to a threat, to a description of a factory network. The humans noticed. Admiral Ewan, Commander Celebreth writes, noticed, and adjusted her pace and her framing, slowing down, offering context, moving to broader descriptions rather than specific numbers. She was, Celebreth wrote, recalibrating her delivery in real time, managing the room. I have been in contact meetings with 31 species over my career, and I have never seen a delegate manage a room that skillfully in a first meeting. She had no context for our responses. She was reading us cold. The third hour was, by all accounts, the one that mattered most. That was when the humans explained why they were here. Admiral Ewan, when she said, "We are reporting for duty," in that first communication, was not speaking metaphorically. She was not using the phrase in any loose or figurative sense. She meant it precisely. Here is the context that requires explaining. Among the intelligence humanity had gathered about the galactic community, through the public channels of the Council's general network, through centuries of passive long-range observation, through the significant investment in linguistic and cultural research that had clearly preceded this moment, was a detailed picture of the galactic political situation. The state of things. And the state of things at the time of the Relentless's arrival was not good. It had not been good for some time. The Pelorian Council's authority across the inner cluster was nominal in several key systems, where the Gruul Confederation had been conducting what the official records carefully described as territorial expression activity, which was a diplomatic way of saying that they were absorbing neighboring systems by force, incrementally, in small enough steps to make formal military response from the Council consistently difficult to justify under the existing treaty frameworks. The Kethavari border systems were experiencing a similar pattern from a different actor. The trade routes through Sector 3 were effectively closed due to ongoing conflict between two species, the Council was theoretically mediating, a mediation that had been ongoing for 11 years with no resolution. The galaxy, to use a blunt phrase, was fraying, not catastrophically, not yet, but fraying at the edges in ways that the Council's existing structures were visibly struggling to address, and the fraying had been accelerating. Humanity had watched this, from a distance, through their long-range observation systems and their network intercepts and their careful reading of everything the Council had ever publicly broadcast. They had watched it for a long time, and they had decided something. Admiral Ewan explained it in the third hour of the meeting, in language that was direct and careful and did not perform more confidence than it needed to. She said, and I am paraphrasing from Commander Celebreth's account, because the actual transcript is restricted, something like this. We spent a long time deciding how to arrive. We could have announced ourselves earlier. We could have sent a smaller ship, a diplomatic vessel, opened communications from a safe distance and asked permission to introduce ourselves. We considered it. We decided against it, because a quiet introduction can be ignored, and what we are here to say is not something that should be ignorable. We are here because the situation in this region of the galaxy is moving in a direction that is harmful to everyone in it, and we have the capacity to affect that trajectory, and we believe we have an obligation to try. We are not here to conquer. We are not here to impose anything. We are here because we have been watching, and we have decided we cannot continue to watch without participating. We are reporting for duty. We want to know if you'll have us. Commander Celebreth writes that the room was very quiet after this. Then Envoy Pethseller, 60 years of diplomacy behind him, said, "You want to join the Council?" Admiral Ewan smiled again, the real kind. "We'd like to start smaller, maybe join the conversation. See where it goes." Part 9. The GRULL incident 3 weeks later. The formal contact negotiations took 3 weeks. I am going to skip most of them, not because they were unimportant. They were enormously important, and the record is thorough, but because negotiations are negotiations, and this story is not about negotiations. This story is about a specific moment, approximately 3 weeks after the Relentless's arrival, and I need to get to that moment. 22 days into the negotiations, a Gruul Confederation tactical fleet, 7 warships, mid-class heavy configuration, entered the Aldine system, which was a Council-affiliated system approximately 4 light towers from Kiva Station along the Sector 7 approach corridor. This was not, in the technical sense, unprecedented behavior from the Gruul. They had been making these kinds of moves incrementally for several years. The Aldine system was valuable for its mineral extraction operations, and the Gruul had signaled interest in it through diplomatic channels that everyone understood to be tactical positioning rather than genuine dialogue. The Council had been managing the situation for 8 months with careful language and escalation-averse maneuvering. The Gruul fleet's entry into the Aldine system was, by the standards of recent Gruul behavior, a significant escalation. 7 warships was more than they had deployed in any previous territorial pressure action. The Council's assessment was that this was a test, not necessarily an intent to occupy immediately, but a test of how the Council would respond, how far they could push before something pushed back. What the Gruul did not know, because the general broadcast of the contact announcement had been limited to inner cluster frequencies, and had not been widely disseminated through the outer regions where the Gruul operated, was that the Relentless was in the sector. The Council's duty officer sent a standard alert to the diplomatic mission, including the human delegation, as a courtesy notification. This was routine. Parties engaged in active negotiations received situation updates. The alert flagged the Gruul incursion, noted the system and the fleet composition, and requested that the human delegation hold their own position while the Council assessed the situation. The human delegation's response came back in approximately 4 minutes. Admiral Ewan directly. "We'd like to offer assistance. With your permission, we'll go take a look." The Council's senior duty officer, a very experienced person named Vetharon, who later became a counselor and whose private journal I have already quoted, told me the story of this exchange years afterward over a meal, and what he said was this. He looked at the message for a long time. He thought about all the procedural reasons to say no, or to say not yet, or to say let's discuss this in a structured forum first. He thought about the fact that sending the Relentless, which at this point had been in contact with the Council for 3 weeks and had not been formally integrated into any framework, had no treaty status, had no defined role, toward an active Gruul tactical deployment was irregular in every conceivable way. He thought about all of this. Then he typed back, "Permission granted, please advise your intentions." The human response was one sentence. "We're just going to have a conversation." What happened in the Aldine system on the 23rd day of the contact negotiations has been called many things in the years since. The official council record calls it the Aldine diplomatic intercession. The Gruul, in their own records, which were eventually disclosed as part of subsequent treaty negotiations, called it something in their language that translates roughly as the day the dark came. Humans typically call it the Aldine incident, and some of them call it other things depending on which aspect of it they find most significant. I was not there. I want to be completely clear about that. Everything I am about to tell you comes from sensor logs, communications intercepts, and after-action accounts from multiple sources, all of which have been cross-referenced and verified. I was on Kiva Station watching displays. But I watched every second that the displays could show me, and I have spent considerable time since talking to people who were there, and I believe I can tell you what happened accurately enough. The Relentless transited to the Aldine system at well. The transit time was not what we expected, based on our calculations of the ship's probable propulsion output. It arrived significantly faster than our models predicted, which was the first indication that our models were understating its capabilities. The Gruul fleet was still in the outer approach ring of the system, which suggested they had not yet committed to advancing on the inhabited portions. The Relentless dropped out of transit at the outer system margin, approximately the same distance from the Gruul fleet as the Gruul fleet was from the colony installations. It did not advance. It stopped, held position, and opened a communication channel. To the Gruul fleet commander. In Gruul Standard Military Communication Protocol. In Gruul. Not in Council Common. In Gruul. The human communications team had apparently prepared translation capacity for Gruul specifically, which told us something about how thoroughly they had anticipated this kind of situation and how thoroughly they had prepared for it. The Gruul fleet commander received a hail in his own language from an unknown vessel at the outer margin of a system he was in the process of pressuring, and the hail said, "The Gruul records give this verbatim. Gruul Commander, I am Admiral Constance Ewan of the interstellar sovereign vessel Relentless, operating in liaison with the Pelorian Council. I'm transmitting our current sensor profile to your tactical board. Please take a moment to review it. Then I'd like to have a conversation with you." The Gruul Fleet Commander, Tactical 7 Korath Dawn, whose account appears in the disclosed Gruul records, wrote the following about this moment. "I received the transmission, and I pulled up their sensor profile as they requested. I looked at it for what I believe was a considerable amount of time. I then asked my tactical officer to verify the readings independently. My tactical officer verified them and said nothing. We both looked at the display. I did not immediately understand what I was looking at, in the sense that I understood the numbers, but my understanding of what the numbers meant was struggling to accommodate the reality they described. Tactical 7 Korath Dawn was an experienced commander. He had conducted 17 territorial operations in his career. He had faced Pelorian Council warships in 2 previous incidents, and had assessed them accurately and chosen his actions accordingly. He was not, by any account, a timid person. He responded to Admiral Ewan's hail in 18 minutes. The Grull records note that most of this delay was spent in conversation with his tactical staff. When he responded, he said, "I have reviewed your sensor profile. Who are you?" Admiral Ewan's response, "I told you who I am. The more relevant question is probably what we are, and I think your sensors have already given you a better answer to that than anything I could say. I'd rather talk about why you're here. This system is council-affiliated. The residents are not bothering anyone. What's the plan?" Korath, "This is a Grull territorial matter." Ewan, "I understand that's the position. I'm suggesting it doesn't have to be. Commander, I have a very large ship and a lot of patient people on it, and I'm happy to talk about this for as long as it takes. But I'd like you to understand something before we start. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to tell you that you need to leave or face consequences. I'm here to have a conversation because I think that's the right first step, and because I believe, genuinely, that there is a version of this situation where nobody does anything they'll regret. So, what would be helpful for your government to have from this system that it currently doesn't have? Let's start there." The Grull records indicate that the conversation lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. At the end of it, Tactical 7 Korath withdrew his fleet from the Aldine system and filed a request through diplomatic channels for a formal mediation session regarding the mineral extraction agreements that had been the underlying basis for the Grull's interest in the system. The request was filed, not with the Pelorian Council's standard mediation office, but specifically requesting human representation in the mediation. The Aldine colony was not occupied. Nobody fired a weapon. The Relentless sat at the outer margin of the system for 4 hours and had a conversation in someone else's language, and then watched a fleet of 7 warships turn around and go home. News moves through the galaxy in the ways that news always has, along the trade lanes, through the diplomatic channels, on the open frequencies that anyone with the right receiver can pick up, through the networks of information brokers who traffic in exactly this kind of material. The story of the Relentless spread in all of these ways simultaneously, and it spread fast, because it was the kind of story that people could not stop talking about once they heard it. The mass reading first, always the mass reading. That was the part that traveled fastest, the number that started conversations and ended them in the same sentence. People heard the number and asked if it was right and were told that yes, it was right. The Council's own sensors confirmed it, multiple independent verification, no dispute. And then they would be quiet for a moment, and then they would usually ask about the other thing, the Aldine thing, which is what many people called it before it got its more formal names. A ship that size shows up. A fleet moves against a civilian system. The ship goes and talks to the fleet in their own language and the fleet leaves. No weapons. No ultimatums in any traditional sense. Just a conversation in which one party to the conversation was apparently aware, was made aware, deliberately, of the relevant numbers, and those numbers were sufficient to reframe the situation. There is a famous painting of the Relentless at Aldine that was made by an artist on the colony world itself, who watched the whole thing from a surface observation dome. The painting is technically a somewhat loose interpretation, because you cannot actually see a ship at that distance from a planetary surface without optical assistance, so the painter relied on data and imagination for the actual form of the vessel. But the scale reference in the painting, the Grull ships as these small dark shapes against the huge form of the Relentless, the colony in the lower frame small and lit and warm-looking, that reference is accurate. The painter got the scale exactly right, which I know because I have seen the sensor data and compared it to the painting. What the painting captures, and why I think it continues to be printed and reproduced, is not a scene of threat or confrontation. It is a scene of presence. The Relentless in the painting does not look like it is attacking anything. It looks like something that is simply there, enormously and undeniably there, with all the implications of its there-ness available for anyone looking to understand. The painting is called The Conversation. I have a reproduction of it in my quarters. I have had it for many years. Part 12. What the Records Don't Capture. I want to tell you about something that happened after the Aldine incident, not in diplomatic chambers or in council sessions, but here on Kiva Station, in the small, ordinary way that things happen in ordinary places. The Relentless had remained in the sector, at the council's request and the human delegation's agreement, while the formal integration process proceeded. The shuttle made several trips between the main vessel and Kiva Station, technical exchange visits, logistics coordination, the slow physical business of two parties beginning to figure out how to work together. This meant that there were, for several weeks, small groups of humans moving through Kiva Station on a more or less regular basis. I saw them in the corridors. I shared the station mess on 3 occasions with groups of them when our schedule cycles overlapped. They were, I want to be accurate here, they were not what I expected, and I want to think carefully about why I didn't expect them. I had been watching the sensor data on the Relentless for weeks. I had been in the room, peripherally, during some of the diplomatic sessions. I had seen the Aldine incident play out on my displays. I had, in other words, a certain picture of what humanity was, assembled from large and significant data points. What I had not assembled was a picture of what humans were like in a mess hall at 7:30 station time. They were loud, not aggressively loud, not threatening, not demanding, just loud in the way that species are when they are comfortable and among their own kind. They laughed a lot. Not the careful diplomatic laughter of formal settings, but real, frequent, genuine laughter, sometimes at things I couldn't track because my common wasn't fast enough to catch the joke before it had passed. They argued not angrily, but vigorously, with the relish of people who genuinely enjoyed the exchange. They ate an enormous amount, which I had been told to expect based on their metabolic documentation, but seeing it is different from reading about it. One morning, this is the specific thing I want to tell you. One of them saw me watching from my usual table and came over. Just walked over with their tray, without any of the formal approach protocols that even species we'd had relations with for centuries tended to use when initiating contact with an unfamiliar individual. Just walked over. "Okay if I sit here?" she asked. Standard common, the same easy fluency as the admiral's. I said yes, because there was no reason not to, and also because I genuinely wanted to see what would happen. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Asha Mehratra. She was one of the navigation officers, 3rd Watch, she told me, which meant she was technically off shift and had hours before she needed to be back on the shuttle. She had a cup of something hot and what appeared to be several portions of whatever the station mess was serving as the day's primary meal, stacked on her tray in a configuration that suggested she was planning to eat all of it. She asked me about the outer veil corridor. Not in the way the diplomatic teams asked questions, with purpose, with agenda, with the consciousness of what information would be useful. She asked because she was curious. She wanted to know how the drift patterns worked in the corridor, how long it took to navigate it in a mid-class vessel, whether the monitoring stations had always been positioned where they were, or if the placement had changed over time. She asked questions the way people ask questions when they are genuinely interested in the answers. She listened when I answered, and asked follow-up questions based on what I had actually said, rather than on where she had apparently already decided the conversation was going. We talked for 45 minutes. I was late to my shift. I did not mind. When she stood to leave, she said, "This is a good station, you know. You've got it set up well. The approach monitoring infrastructure especially, we were reading your detection protocols on the way in and they're solid. You found us faster than we expected." She paused. "That's a compliment, not a criticism. We were glad to be found." She picked up her tray and left, and I sat at my table for a moment, and I thought about what she had said. They were glad to be found. They had come across known space, across whatever distance separated their home system from ours, in a ship that could not be missed, and they were glad that we had found them, that we had seen them coming and reached out first, that the long silence between us had ended with someone saying hello and getting an answer. I went to my shift 12 minutes late and filed no explanation because I was not sure how to explain it in any official format, and Commander Celebreth looked at the time log and at me and then looked away without saying anything, which was her way of granting me the 12 minutes. Part 13. What the Galaxy Learned. In the weeks and months after the Aldine incident, the broader galactic community processed the arrival of humanity in the ways that communities process things that don't fit into existing categories. Slowly, unevenly, with simultaneous overreaction and underreaction from different quarters. The Gruul Confederation's official diplomatic position shifted almost immediately. The shift was not announced as a shift, because no government announces that its position has shifted in response to a development it finds alarming. It was reframed as a recalibration of priorities in light of evolving regional context. But the substance of it was clear. The incremental territorial pressure operations in the Sector 7 corridor slowed. The Aldine mediation request, which had been lodged by Tactical 7 Korath Dawn, was followed within 2 weeks by 3 similar requests from other contested zones. The Gruul were not, as a civilization, retreating from their strategic interests, but they were clearly reassessing the tactical landscape. The Kethavari were more direct, as they often are. It is a cultural quality I have always respected. Their council representative requested a formal briefing on the Relentless's specifications within 4 days of the Aldine incident. The briefing was given. The Kethavari representative's response, filed in the formal record, was 11 words. We would like to discuss a mutual assistance agreement with the human delegation. The Murren Deep, who had been conducting their own slow withdrawal from the inner cluster for reasons of their own that the Council had never fully understood, sent an observer delegation to Kiva Station within 3 weeks. They did not make any formal statements. They just sent observers. The observers watched the diplomatic proceedings, watched the humans moving through the station, and after 10 days they filed a single communication requesting that they be included in the next general contact briefing. Nothing more, but they had come back into contact. They had decided to be part of what was happening. That decision meant something, even if it was not announced. The contested system in Sector 3, where the 11-year mediation had stalled, the one I mentioned earlier, the one the Council had been managing without resolution, requested human mediation within 6 weeks of the Aldine incident. The human delegation accepted. The mediation took 4 months. It produced an agreement. A real agreement, not a temporary framework, not a pause in hostilities declaration. A genuine long-form territorial and resource agreement, signed by both parties, witnessed by the Council, with human diplomatic representation as the mediating authority. 11 years, then 4 months. The formal address that Admiral Constance Ewan gave to the full Interstellar Council plenary session, held 31 days after the Relentless's first communication, is recorded in full in the Council archive. I am not going to reproduce it here, for the obvious reasons, but I want to tell you about one part of it. Near the end of the address, after the formal statements, after the treaty language and the framework proposals, and the questions from Council members that she answered with the same careful directness she brought to everything, someone asked her a question that was not on the formal agenda. The question came from a junior representative, a young Kethavari named Selnvo, who later became quite a significant figure in the new Council structure that emerged from this period, but who at this point was only a few years into the role. Selnvo asked, "You built the largest ship in known galactic history. You crossed known space without announcing yourselves. You have demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything we have documented for any species in the current era. And your stated purpose is to help. I want to believe that. I want to accept it on its face, But I have to ask why. Why does a species capable of what you're capable of want to spend its time on this? What do you want from us? The formal record notes a pause before the response. Admiral Ewan's responses were mostly prompt. This pause was unusual. Then she said, "When we were young, when we were where most of you were, or where some of you still are in terms of reaching outward and trying to understand what was out there, we had a lot of hard periods, wars, generations of conflict, problems we kept making worse because we couldn't find a way to sit down together and work them out. We know what that looks like from the inside, and we know what it costs. And we watched from a distance for a long time, and we could see some of the same patterns starting here. And we thought maybe the most useful thing we can do with what we've built is show up, not to take anything, not to run anything, just to be a weight on the scale that makes the conversation go differently, just to make it easier to choose a different direction than the one that's easiest to slide into." She looked at Selmvo directly. "That's it. That's the whole answer. We know how this can go when it goes badly. We'd rather it go another way, and we happen to build something big enough to be useful." The record notes that Representative Selmvo was quiet for a moment after this. "Then, that is either the most naive statement I have ever heard, or the most honest." Admiral Ewan said, "It can be both." Part 15, years later. I have spent 23 years since that day on Kiva Station, doing various things in various places. I left the station 2 years after the initial contact, joined the Council's newly formed First Contact and Integration Bureau, spent 8 years in that role, and eventually ended up where I am now, retired from active service, living on a quiet station in the mid-corridor systems, writing these accounts at the request of the Archive Division, which is assembling a comprehensive witness record of the First Contact period. This is my contribution to that record. I have been asked, many times over those years, what the most important thing was. Not the most dramatic, not the most historically significant in the formal sense. Those questions have answers that are well documented and widely taught. But the most important thing in the personal sense, the thing that changed me most as a witness. I always come back to the slowness. The relentless, when it came into the outer veil corridor, moved slowly. When the shuttle came to Kiva Station, it moved slowly. When the humans walked off the shuttle and met the Council delegation, they moved in a way that was unhurried, careful, designed to give observers time to adjust. And this slowness was not weakness. It was not uncertainty. They were not slow because they were unsure of themselves or because they were afraid. The relentless had a maximum rated velocity that was, we learned later, significantly beyond anything in the Council's fleet. The slowness was a choice, a deliberate, sustained choice to not use all of what they were capable of, because the situation called for something other than capability. You can learn a lot about a person or a species from the gap between what they are capable of and what they choose to do. The humans closed an enormous distance to reach us. They built something that took 31 years and the labor of an entire civilization. They arrived at the edge of our space with more force than we had a category for, and they moved slowly. They spoke carefully. They asked permission. They sat down with a Grull fleet commander for 4 hours and had a conversation when they could have, by any rational calculation, done anything else and had it go differently. That is the thing I think about. Part 16, The Relentless Today. The ISV Relentless is, as of this writing, still on active deployment. It has not been stationed permanently in any system. It moves, on a rotation that the Council and the Human Liaison Command maintain on a joint basis, through the contested and sensitive corridors where its presence is most relevant to the ongoing diplomatic work of the region. It does not fire its weapons often. The records, which I have access to as part of my archive work, show 11 instances over 23 years in which the Relentless's weapons were actively deployed. In all 11 instances, the deployment was defensive, responding to direct hostile action against civilian populations or Council-affiliated vessels. In all 11 instances, the action was brief, measured, and followed immediately by a communication to the relevant parties offering to discuss what had happened and what might prevent it from happening again. It has mediated 47 disputes. It has been present as an observer at 63 formal diplomatic processes where its presence, everyone understood, was a kind of argument for taking the process seriously. It has conducted search and rescue operations in 11 crisis situations. It has carried relief supplies and medical teams on 6 occasions to systems experiencing catastrophic failure of one kind or another. It has never conquered anything. It has never claimed a system. It has never demanded tribute or advantage or territorial concession from anyone. It shows up, and it helps, and then it goes where it is needed next. This is not nothing. I want to be careful not to make it sound more poetic than it is. The Relentless's presence changes calculations. It alters what is possible and what isn't. Power always works that way, even when it is not being deployed, especially when it is not being deployed. The fact that the ship doesn't need to do anything most of the time is part of what it does. This is complicated, and the complications are real. I am not pretending the world became simple. The world became different. In measurable ways, in ways that show up in the mortality statistics of contested systems, and in the frequency of formal diplomatic resolutions, and in the years that have not happened. The conflicts that were heading somewhere and then changed direction, the escalations that paused and de-escalated, the crises that began and ended without becoming catastrophes. Those are harder to document than the things that did happen, but they are there in the data if you know how to look. I want to end with something small, because I started with something small, and I think it is appropriate. 2 years after the initial contact, when I was in my last weeks on Kiva Station before transferring to the Integration Bureau, I was on a late watch. 300 station time, the quiet dead-of-night watch when most of the crew is on skeleton rotation, and the station has a particular quality of stillness that it only has in those hours. I was the senior analyst on the floor. There was one junior technician running routine checks, and a maintenance drone working through its programmed cycle somewhere in the station's secondary corridors, and that was it. I was watching the long-range array, as I had been watching it for 2 years, and at 3:17 I saw something I recognized. The Relentless was on station at the time. It had returned 3 days earlier for scheduled maintenance exchange and crew rotation, which happened periodically at Kiva, because Kiva Station had become one of the designated coordination points in the human liaison infrastructure. The ship was holding at the outer margin position, the same position it had first taken when it arrived, as if it had simply gotten used to that particular spot and found it agreeable. At 3:17, the ship's running lights, the gold lines along the hull that I had watched on the approach display 2 years earlier, came on in a specific sequence. Not the navigation lighting, not the approach lighting. The ceremonial lines, the ones that ran the full length of the hull in that warm gold color. They came on from stern to bow, a slow wave of illumination that took several seconds to travel the ship's full length. I watched it and I did not know what it meant. I sent a query to the communications log to check if there had been any exchange around that time. There had not. I asked Lieutenant Commander Mehratra about it the next day, when she was on the station for a logistics meeting. She was one of the people whose schedule I had come to know well enough to catch in the corridors. She looked at me when I described it and smiled. "Oh," she said, "the dawn run." "What is that?" "When we're on a long deployment and someone calculates that it's morning back home, in Sol system, I mean, on Earth, sometimes we run the dawn lights, just to mark it. It's not a regulation or anything. It's just a thing the crew does. Someone checks the time in whatever the local zone is for their family, and if it would be sunrise for them, they put it on the board, and if enough people on shift agree, we run the lights." I thought about that for a moment. You do this in the middle of deep space. Happens more than you'd think, she said. 23rd century and we're still homesick at 317. She shrugged, smiling. That's the thing about going very far from somewhere. No matter how far you go or how big the thing you're in is, the distance is still the distance. She went to her meeting. I stood in the corridor for a moment. A ship that could rewrite the shape of galactic power, that had arrived out of the unknown and stopped a fleet with a 4-hour conversation, that carried 42,000 people and weapon systems that made military strategists sit very still. And at 3:17, someone on the operations floor had looked up what time it would be for their mother, and it would have been sunrise, and they had run the dawn lights. The distance is still the distance. That is the thing I think about most. Not the mass reading, though I think about that too. Not the Aldine incident, though it changed everything. Not even that first 8-word message coming through the speakers on the operations floor with the whole room not breathing. I think about the gold light running slow from stern to bow in the dark of 317, 42,000 people marking a sunrise that none of them could see, because home is home no matter how far you've come from it. Because you can build the biggest thing anyone has ever built and cross the longest distance anyone has ever crossed and arrive in a place where they don't have a category for what you are, and you are still, underneath all of it, a person who remembers which direction the light comes from in the morning and misses it. That is what they brought to the galaxy. Not just the ship themselves,